Good afternoon. My name is Paul Devamithran, and I'm on the development team here at Patrick Henry College. We've been honored to host the Newsmaker series for several years now, and we are very excited to cap off this week's interviews with a very special guest. By this time, you all should know that none of this would be possible without the tremendous work of Dr. Marvin Olasky. Dr. Olasky is, of course, an accomplished author and the editor-in-chief of World Magazine, and we here at Patrick Henry College are also privileged to know him as a professor of journalism and holder of the Distinguished Chair of Journalism and Public Policy. Our special guest today is Professor David Skeel. Professor Skeel is also an accomplished author and is a professor of corporate law. Is that right, sir?
That's correct.
Corporate law at University of Pennsylvania Law School. Professor Skeel has authored 3 books: The New Financial Deal, Understanding the Dodd-Frank Act and Its Unintended Consequences, Icarus in the Boardroom, and Debt's Dominion, A History of Bankruptcy Law in America. Professor Skeel has appeared on several talk shows, including NPR, Nightline, Hardball, and has published several articles, including ones on Christianity in the law, poetry in the law, and sovereign debt. Professor, I trust you'll find this particular community especially eager to hear from you on some, if not all, of those subjects. I do want to just mention quickly that Professor Skeel is also an elder in his Presbyterian Church in Philadelphia and has received numerous awards from the University of Pennsylvania Law School for excellence in teaching. Professor, we are very grateful to your students and your community for lending you to us today. With that, please join me in welcoming Dr. Marvin Olasky and Professor David Skeel.
Well, thank you, and thank you all for coming. David, as you heard, has published books on several topics, the last 2 being on Dodd-Frank's, which he'll explain in a moment what that is, and then also this one here, which I recommend highly. Dodd-Frank's is good, I think. I'm not sure I really recommend it because you have to have particular interest there, but this one is something that everyone in the family can use. Basically, everyone in the family of Christ, and a lot of people who aren't in that family yet. True Paradox, How Christianity Makes Sense of Our Complex World. So let me just ask first about Dodd-Frank's. Let's get that out of the way. We're not going to spend a whole lot of time on that. But what is Dodd-Frank's, and why should anyone care about that?
Well, it hurts my feelings that you don't care about Dodd-Frank.
Well, gotta be honest
Marvin,
here.
So Dodd-Frank is the name of the financial legislation that was put in place after the 2008 crisis. So it was put in place in 2010. And it is a giant piece of legislation. It's 2,319 pages long that has completely restructured the way we regulate banks and other financial institutions. So when you hear about big banks and proposals to break them up and do other things, those are conversations about the Dodd-Frank Act. I was invited by a publisher to write about the Dodd-Frank Act in 2010, right when it was being passed. And so I spent a summer reading it. I had already been writing about related issues and then writing this book. And a small group of very nerdy people read this sort of thing, and that does not include Marvin.
No, I have read it, and I can say with a little bit of exaggeration, but not entirely, I actually enjoyed it.
Wow.
Anyway, it's there are perverse pleasures like that in a sense. But Dodd-Frank, after Barney Frank, one of the leading experts on.
Exactly. It was Christopher Dodd, the former senator from Connecticut, and Barney Frank, the congressman from Massachusetts.
Has it done any good?
It's a real mixed bag. Some of it actually is good, I think. And it's hard to characterize the goodness of it without really getting down into the weeds. But it introduced some regulation of derivatives and other financial contracts that I think is pretty good. Other parts of it I think are not good at all. What it did, one of the main themes of my book is that it created a form of corporatism, which is the way in Europe corporations tend to be regulated, and the underlying principle is we'll allow these giant institutions to exist as long as they do the government's bidding, as long as they do what the government wants. And that's, in my view, more or less what got set up by Dodd-Frank. And that's one of the main themes of the book, is that it introduced corporatism or magnified corporatism in this country.
Created more jobs for lawyers?
It did create jobs for lawyers. Lots of my students are now in Washington doing different things than many of y'all who are going to go to Washington will be doing. And they're working for regulators.
Yeah. It was sold, as I recall, as something that'll prevent us from having a debacle of 2008 again. Will it?
So it was sold as bringing an end to taxpayer bailouts, is what President Obama said when he signed it. No, it's not going to end taxpayer bailouts. It might make the kind of crisis we had in 2008 a little bit less likely, and there's some stuff that's happened apart from the legislation that I think will be helpful along those lines. But no, I don't think it. I'm pretty confident it has not ended the kinds of problems we thought we saw in 2008. It has addressed a few of them, but some of the problems are still there.
Okay. Do you think we'll have another 2008?
It's a good question. I think probably we will in time. I don't think we're going to have one in the near term. I don't think one is on the horizon now. But I do think it's possible, and Dodd-Frank sets up a lot of rules that theoretically are designed to stop bailouts, to limit what the Federal Reserve can do. None of those will work at the end of the day. So if we have a big crisis with a big bank, the Federal Reserve can bail them out if they want to, and I think that's likely to be what happens. I should only say likely because I've been involved in a lot of conversations about how to improve our bankruptcy process so you could actually let one of these institutions file for bankruptcy. And I think some progress has been made. So I think it is possible we're in a better place than we were, but I would not say it's safe to go home at night and rest assured that there'll never be another crisis like 2008.
So is there a common denominator in these two very different books, your book on Dodd-Frank and this book on here, True Paradox, namely that law doesn't settle our problems?
I think that's a great common denominator between the two. In fact, when you started to ask that question, I thought you were going to ask me to answer the question, what's the connection between the two of them? And I would have hemmed and hawed, but I think you have it exactly right. I mean, the theme that underlies both of them, or important parts of both of them, is that law can't save us. We have a temptation to think that if we just put the right laws in place, we can prevent financial crises, we can solve the moral problems of the country. History tells us, and the Bible tells us, that's not possible. Law cannot save us, and we need to be humble about what the secular law can do.
Okay, so let's turn from, to use a couple of 19th century expressions, let's turn from the dismal science to the queen of science, it's theology. And odd in a way that you're writing this because you said at one point in an interview that you had zero religious experience growing up. Your mom was a teacher, your dad an Air Force doctor. Tell us about growing up and then how finally you realized that there's beauty in the Bible.
Absolutely. So I'll start out by saying the reference to me having zero religious background was in a very nice New York Times story about this book. When my mother read that, she wasn't too thrilled about that comment. She has become a Christian in recent years, but my parents both came from church-going families that didn't fully internalize their faith. They went to church because that's what people did. And when my parents got married and started moving around with the military, they just stopped going to church. So I was in a church 3 or 4 times the first 18 years of my life. Had no religious background at all. I got to college. I was at the University of North Carolina, and like many people, when they get to college who are not Christians, I started thinking there must be more to life than what I had seen, that I jumped through all the hoops I was supposed to be jumping through, and I had this deep sense that there had to be more to existence than what I was seeing in my life. That started me down the road to thinking about Christianity. The big step for me was I was an English major in college. We read lots of books that had biblical themes in them. And for me, when we read these books that had biblical themes in them, I never knew what the themes were because I'd never been to Sunday school class. I didn't know the stories. And the experience that kind of was cathartic for me, in first a negative way, but ultimately a positive way, is I was taking a class and we were reading a book, a short story called The Ram in the Thicket, a very famous mid-20th century short story. Ram in the Thicket, as everybody here no doubt knows, is a reference to the Abraham and Isaac story and God providing a ram as a substitute sacrifice. I had no idea what that story was about. I had no clue what was going on, what the subtext of the story was. And after enduring a class where I felt really ignorant, I decided at the least I needed to read the Bible. And so that summer, the summer after my sophomore year in college, I went out west with a couple friends of mine. We took a van and drove it across the country. I started reading the Bible in the back of the van, and by the time I'd gotten into a few chapters into Genesis, I was persuaded it was true. I had never read anything so beautiful, so psychologically real. It was just different than everything that I'd ever read before. That was the first step for me, the first major step down the road to becoming a Christian. I became a Christian about a year later and am still trying to learn exactly what it means to be a follower of Christ. But those were the big steps for me, going from a background with no religion at all to a direct encounter with God in the Bible, in His revealed Word.
So Muslims tend to dislike Genesis because the heroes are often not particularly heroic. You know, Abraham is so scared that he, in essence, offers his wife. You know, Jacob is a deceiver. You just go all on and on and on. You know, Joseph and so forth. Noah gets drunk. All these great prophets in Islam. But you found that to be something that made it real. And
Exactly. I had precisely the opposite experience. When I read about Abraham, when I read about Noah, when I read about Joseph, I said, I know these people. These are real people. God is using real people in history. And any book that doesn't have that quality, that doesn't look like the world we inhabit, I don't find compelling. So I did have exactly the opposite experience. The flaws were what made it real to me. And it's still a big part of what it makes it real. You know, the fact that Peter was so flawed, you know, that Peter renounced Jesus before he was willing to give up his life for Jesus. Those are people I understand. I guess intuitively at a very early age, I had a sense of my own sin and the sin of people around me. And seeing that portrayed in a complex way, I found very powerful and very real.
in a way, you saw the difference between public relations and journalism, or journalism/history.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Because the Bible is not something that seems like a propaganda document, just because it's the flaws of the patriarchs are there exhibited for everyone to see.
Absolutely, absolutely.
So,
And I definitely do line myself up on the journalism side of the public relations journalism divide. In fact, I find myself thinking recently, why in the world we have a spokesperson for the president and for other people, because their job is to prevent you from getting to the truth, whereas journalism is designed to do just the opposite.
And then I gather that Christianity also impressed you because it's complicated.
Absolutely, absolutely. And that goes together, I think. The fact that the psychological complexity of Christianity was really powerful for me. And the other form of complexity I think that was most powerful and is most powerful is the complexity of the language in the Bible, the fact that it mixes so many different genres. And one of the things I've come to believe very deeply is that truth can't be conveyed in a single genre. And the fact that the Bible is such a mix of genres and different kinds of language and different kinds of images, to me, is part of the evidence for its veracity.
And that's one of the things that also makes Muslims distrust it. The idea that there are the different genres, that it has all these different writers, as opposed to one writer and basically one genre, speechifying. I mean, in the Quran, as compared to all the different ones in the Bible. So, in a way, diversity versus unicity.
Absolutely. And I mean, another of the really compelling things about the Bible for me is that it actually has both of those, so that we have God who is one throughout, but we have the other players in the Bible, and most importantly, we have Christ and the Holy Spirit. I think the fact that Jesus is both man and God, the fact that God is one God but also three persons, for me, that reinforces both the complexity and the truth of the Bible. The idea that God was just one voice and there was no deviation from that voice would not seem compelling to me, at least myself personally.
And that's the title here, True Paradox. So that's
exactly. That's the complexity and the paradox.
Yeah, when I taught basically a comparative religion course at the University of Texas for many years, I would describe Christianity, or try to, as an English muffin religion with lots of nooks and crannies. So that might seem disrespectful in some way. And then I referred to Islam in a way that I had to explain at one point as a bowling alley religion. Namely, there are lanes. It's very clear. And in fact, in some ways, it's the lanes are oiled to have the ball go smoothly down it, and very different from Christianity. So it's the complexity, the diversity, the paradox of Christianity that bothers lots of people. But to you, that was a sign of its truth.
Absolutely.
Okay. So how did your thinking has changed over the course of this year? Then what do you do?
So then what I do is, I'm not sure if this is the way you wanted to go, but then what I do is I go to England for a year and work at a bookstore and see Christians who are actually living out their faith day by day. I had become a Christian by the end of college. Actually, to finish that story, I said the first step for me to becoming a Christian was reading the Bible and being persuaded that it's true. The second step for me becoming a Christian, and the point at which I believe I did become a Christian, was after my couple fraternity brother, roommate, friends, and I had been to a series of talks at the University of North Carolina that were designed for fraternity and sorority students. It was called Greek Christian Fellowship. We went to these talks about the gospel. I was standing after the last of these talks in the second floor of the fraternity house that I lived in with one of my roommates, one of my fraternity brothers. We were talking, just the two of us. We were standing in the bathroom on the second floor, just the two of us, talking about the talk. And he turned to me and he said, "You don't actually believe this stuff, do you?" And I said, "I do." And for me to say publicly that I believed in Jesus, to publicly identify myself with him in even this trivially small way, was absolutely life-changing for me. I knew that, I had no idea where that came from. I had no idea why. I didn't think I was a Christian at that point in time, but when I said I do, it was sort of like being married. That moment I married Jesus, and I knew that that was for good, that my life was changed and it would never be the same. So that was the second and decisive step for me becoming a Christian. And then what happened from there is I went to England for the better part of a year before I went to law school, really saw people living out their faith, began seeing a little bit of what it might mean to truly follow Christ. And then I went to law school, and I wound up teaching. And Wednesday, I taught my last class for this semester, which was exactly 25 years of teaching. So Wednesday completed 25 years of teaching.
Okay, but next fall is going to be the beginning of 26.
It's going to be the beginning of 26. I have to do it all over. And maybe at 50, I'll get it right.
Okay. So since you emphasized the complexity and, in fact, the paradox of Christianity, I suspect that you're not thrilled when you see descriptions of the Bible as, the operating manual for planet Earth, or things like that try to set it up in that simplistic way.
I do worry when I feel as though the Bible is getting hijacked. And in fact, if you were to ask me, why did I write this book, True Paradox, there's a long, involved story about how precisely the book came to be. But the short answer was I found it really frustrating to hear biblical Christianity and Christians described in a way that wasn't identifiable to me, that had nothing to do with my faith and what I believe Christianity is. And I just felt as though in our culture, when Christianity is characterized, it's often characterized in an unrecognizable way, and often as simplistic, non-complex. And so when I do hear attempts to say Christianity is this or it's that, I do recoil. I mean, my initial reaction is always to push back. And in a sense, this book could be described as pushing back. I'd like to think of it not just as pushing back. It's really designed to show people who think there's no reason even to take Christianity seriously, any reason to even think about it, to show people of that sort, who I'm surrounded by in my professional life, to show them that actually Christianity is much more plausible than they may think, and that it is worth taking seriously, and that it is more complex than they may have heard and may have believed it to be.
So you have a chapter about beauty in the arts, and you talk about one of the problems often of Christian artists now, giving Thomas Kincaid as an example. Talk about that a little bit.
So one of the questions one of the issues that I talk about in the chapter on beauty is the way that Christianity explains beauty. And in my view, Christianity offers a compelling explanation of the experience we have in the presence of beauty. In particular, the fact that all of us, either in the presence of artistic beauty or natural beauty, has at one time or another had an experience of absolute transcendence, where you feel like you're in touch with something greater than yourself and is the way the universe is meant to be, on the one hand, but on the other hand, a melancholy that goes along with it, the sense that this experience is temporary. So I make an argument, but I think I'm just showing that the Bible provides a really good explanation for this, whereas science without God perspectives on the world, which is the principal perspective I'm surrounded by in an academic world, those perspectives can't really explain beauty very well. So that's the context. And the question I raise is, does that mean that Christian artists should always be superior to non-Christian artists? And I go on from there to make the comment that many others have made, that a lot of Christian art strikes me as flat and is not very powerful. And the question is, why is that? My initial answer to that is, I think there's often a temptation, even among Christians, to try to oversimplify the world and to try to make the world more simple than it is, and I think that is to the detriment of the art. And so one of the examples I use in the book, the one particular example I use, is the artist Thomas Kincaid, who was a very, very talented artist, but his paintings leave me cold, and they have a similar effect on many people. And I think the reason that they're very beautiful in a sense, but they're limited in my view. And in my view, what limits them is there's no sense of sin in them, that it's a world from which sin has been excluded, where sin is not allowed, and they strike me as not true to the world that we inhabit, and not as complex as art that has both beauty and sin and suffering in it. So that's one of the answers I give to the question, why do you see bad Christian art? Another answer I give is, I believe in common grace. I believe that artistic talent is scattered through all the world, not just with Christians, and that some people have more of it than others. And the illustration I use from the Bible there is when Solomon built the temple, he singled out 2 artisans who were particularly gifted. And by singling them out, he suggested the other artisans in Israel were not quite so gifted.
A lot of Christian novels, or those designated as Christian novels, have gotten a bad reputation because it's almost that the authors feel like a bad TV drama or situation comedy. They have to wrap everything up, tie a bow on it, and everyone lives happily ever after, which is not really a realistic depiction of life.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I do think there's a sense that many novelists, many artists, Christian artists have, that you do have to tie everything together, and that the work needs to have an immediately identifiable moral. That it has to be ready for Cliff Notes. You have to be able to summarize it in a paragraph or 2, and that summary has to be uplifting. And the world isn't that way, or it often isn't that way. I think there's a role for uplifting novels and uplifting arts of other sorts, but very frequently that kind of art is limited. It is limiting itself, and it's limiting itself by excluding a lot of the complexity of the world. I think the kind of art that has the biggest impact on people is art that is as complex as the world that we find ourselves in.
So what Christian writers or artists or musicians would you recommend who you think actually do take into account the complexity?
It's a great question. We were talking earlier about the novelist Marilynne Robinson. I had the privilege of introducing her at a Veritas Forum event a week or so ago. I think she's a writer like that. I think her novels have that kind of complexity. They're very beautiful. She's very talented. So she would be in that category for me of writers who are writing now. Thinking of the poets I love, someone like Gerard Manley Hopkins really captures the richness and difficulty of the world, I think, as well. T.S. Eliot, I think a lot of people would say he's not my favorite 20th century modernist poet. I actually really love a couple of the non-Christian modernist poets. I really love Wallace Stevens. I really love, I'm reading a lot of Ezra Pound right now. Neither of them were Christian, but I think their work has some of the kinds of complexity and elements that we've been describing. Eliot would be in that category as well. I could go on, but those are a few.
And then you have a chapter on suffering. And tell us about the person who was supposed to be your co-author, Bill Stuntz.
Absolutely. So I said that when I was describing how this book came into being, there was a longer story with it, and the longer story involved Bill Stuntz. Bill Stuntz was a brilliant criminal law scholar at Harvard for the last 11 years of his career. He was before that at the University of Virginia, which is where I met him when I was in law school. Dear friend of mine, we wrote together a bit, and he wrote a lot separately. We talked about writing this book together, and at the time when we talked about writing a book like this together, Bill had very, very severe back issues for almost a decade, so that he often was teaching in a wheelchair at Harvard. By the time we had started having conversations about this book, which was 2008, Bill had learned that he had colon cancer. And one of the terrible ironies of his colon cancer is he was so used to pain, and he had been in pain for so long, he didn't recognize that something was going on within him until the tumor was very large and was stage 4 when it was discovered. When we talked about writing a book of defense of Christianity, Bill made the comment that if his prognosis was good, we could finish the book together, but if the prognosis was bad, he had a criminal justice project he needed to finish, and we wouldn't be able to write the book together. So that was 2008. Unfortunately, his prognosis was not good. By early 2011, he was dying. Well, he'd been dying for 3 years. He was very close to dying at that point. The last conversation I had with Bill, which was in his house in Belmont, Massachusetts, it was a week or so, about 2 weeks before he died, Bill said the one thing he was most sad that he would not be able to finish on earth was this book that we had hoped to write together. Now, no doubt Bill told this to many people. He said the one thing I really wanted to do was the thing we were going to do together. But I felt from the time Bill died, I carried this around as a burden. I felt it was something that if God gave me time, I needed to do. I'll go ahead and finish the story. I'm talking at too great a length, but so a year after Bill died, I hadn't done anything further on the book, but I moderated a Veritas forum at the University of Pennsylvania, where I am, with the English apologist John Lennox, and I was just asking questions to John Lennox. The day after the forum, I got an email from an atheist postdoctoral student at Penn. He sent me an email thanking me for asking John Lennox really difficult questions, he said. And in response to that email, I said, why don't we get together for coffee, and maybe we can talk about some of the issues that make you an atheist, that you think are and aren't compelling about Christianity. And so we started getting together for coffee. We're still getting together for coffee. And after 2 or 3 of these coffees, I thought, I should just start writing this book. And so I did, and it took me about 9 months to figure that the book was about complexity. Marvin summarized in one question what took me 9 months to figure out. And after I figured out what the book was really about, I wrote it pretty quickly, and it came out last fall.
So why did Bill Stuntz die?
So why did Bill Stuntz die? I could answer that question in a lot of different ways. I'm not sure why you're looking for. So I'll just answer in a couple different ways, sure, and you can follow up. So in the most literal sense, he died because of the colon cancer that he had, and he had several rounds of chemotherapy over the 3-year period from early 2008 to early 2011 when he died. We were doing a blog together at the time, a blog called Less Than the Least, which we started after he got the cancer diagnosis. Bill wrote a lot about his cancer during that time. So if you're ever interested, if you're suffering or you know somebody who's suffering, I would really encourage you to read his cancer posts on that blog, on the health and daily life section of the blog. So in the most literal sense, he died because he had cancer and the radiation was not able to eliminate it all. In the scheme of things, I don't know how God is organizing history, so I don't want to claim to know how providence is unfolding. What I do know is that through Bill's suffering, he touched enormous numbers of lives. That some of his posts on his suffering were published in church bulletins. He wrote an article for Christianity Today, the other Christian magazine. If he had lived a little longer, he would have written something for World, I'm confident. And I will try to write in his voice for World as much as I can. He touched enormous numbers of lives as he was dying, the way he died. And one of the most profound effects in my life, as a result of Bill's suffering and the way he handled his suffering is I spent this past semester teaching at Harvard Law School. One of the reasons, well, I'll say something a little, I'll go in a slightly different direction with this. When the dean of Harvard Law School called me up to invite me to teach at Harvard Law School, she said, we'd like you to come here for a semester because we're interested in both of the areas that you work in, David. And I said, so I know I work in bankruptcy. I know Elizabeth Warren is now in Washington. So I could see why you might want a bankruptcy person. What's the other area I work in that's of interest? And she said, Christianity. She said, you know, your friend Bill Stunts passed away a couple years ago. We don't have anybody replacing what he brought to the law school. She didn't put it exactly that way, but the point was, and the point I'm making is, Bill lived out evangelical Christianity at Harvard Law School in a way that made at least a few people there think that they'd like to have more of it rather than less of it. And I think that's part of what happened in Bill's, as Bill was dying as well, and in some larger scheme, that's part of what that was about. I talk a lot about Bill and the way he suffered in the chapter on suffering in the book. And one of the things I talk about is I compare what Bill said as he was dying, what Bill wrote as he was dying, to what Christopher Hitchens, the new atheist, wrote and said as Christopher Hitchens was dying. And it's a really interesting comparison, I think. It's not completely different. There were some things that they agreed on, and in his way, Christopher Hitchens, as he died very powerfully. I mean, he really stood true to his principles. But there was a hope in Bill, and that came across in the way he suffered. And it's really helped a lot of people already who are suffering to understand what it means to suffer and what it means that Christ suffered for us, that when we suffer, we're participating in something that our Savior participated in as well. And the way in which that's evidence that our God is not distant from us, but our God has experienced the things that we experience.
You mentioned in your blog, one of your posts several months ago, starting with a professor at the University of Virginia, Gregory Orr, who at age 12 accidentally shot and killed his brother. And then you go into a similar tragedy, parallel tragedy in some ways, a young girl shooting her gun instructor accidentally. What's more comforting in that situation? Is it comforting to believe this is accidental? Is it comforting to believe it's all part of God's design in some way? How do you, as an elder, let's say ministerially, deal with suffering in that way?
So that's a really, really hard question, I think.
You have 5 seconds in which to answer.
The way I've answered the other questions, you're probably worried about how long I'm going to take to answer this question.
It's fine.
So I'd say a couple of things about that. One is, in my experience, to say there is a larger plan is often not helpful for people who are suffering, because what they're experiencing is suffering beyond anything that they can imagine. And I think it's more helpful, or I would be inclined to focus more on the fact that Christ has suffered on our behalf. Christ knows what suffering is like. He's experienced whatever it is that you or the other person is experiencing. You know, as Isaiah said in one of the great prophecies of Christ, he was marred beyond human semblance. He was afflicted, stricken by God. To know that when you're suffering, I think, is a great comfort. So I don't think it's helpful to think that it's all completely accidental, because if you think it's all just accidental, then you're going to be you're going to end up with a nihilist perspective about everything. That nothing matters. If something this awful is accidental, everything else is accidental. Why should I try to improve the world in any way? But I also wouldn't say, at least initially, this is part of a grander plan. I believe that it is. But I think it's important to focus on Jesus, the fact that he suffered, God suffered in Jesus, and also that God has shown he can transform suffering. He transformed suffering in Jesus' resurrection. The story of the transformation of suffering that meant the most to Bill as he was dying is the story of Joseph, where in the famous passage where Joseph says that all the awful things that were done to him by his brothers were meant for evil, but God meant them for good. God transformed that evil, that suffering that others had inflicted on Joseph. So that's the way I go at those kinds of questions. But I also think it's really important, as one who is not suffering at this moment, not to pretend that I can understand somebody else's suffering. And just one other stray thing I'll say about that is, one thing someone like Bill could do is speak to someone else who has cancer or has that kind of suffering. And one thing that we can do, if we've suffered in a particular way, if we've accidentally shot a brother, is we may be able to speak to somebody who suffered that kind of tragedy and come alongside them and be a comfort to them and portray Christ to them in a way that somebody who has not suffered similarly cannot.
So Bill was able to show, as miserable and tragic as it was for him and his family and friends, you can see that good came out of it in terms of the effect he had on other people.
Absolutely. And vice versa. I know when Bill got his cancer diagnosis, people who had cancer reached out to him. Tony Snow reached out to him, for instance, after he had cancer. And I think Bill was very much helped by that as well. And Bill helped others in a similar way.
Okay. Just a couple more, and then we'll turn to questions from y'all. You have a chapter on justice, and you call for law with a light touch. A nice expression. Could you explain what you mean by that? So
what I mean by law with a light touch is a humility about what we try to achieve with the law. In this country in particular, it's not limited to this country, but in this country in particular, we have a long history of thinking that if we only pass the right law, we can solve our problems, particularly our moral problems. If we ban the making and selling of alcohol, we won't have drunkenness anymore. If we ban gambling, we won't have gambling anymore. The argument that I make in the book is I think that's a misunderstanding about what Christianity says about law, and in particular what the Sermon on the Mount suggests about law. What the Sermon on the Mount, to me, suggests about law is that there's a difference between God's law and our law. In God's law, even looking at a woman with lust is adultery. Being angry at your brother is murder, because God knows the human heart. We don't know one another's hearts, and I think we have to be a lot more careful about what we try to do with law, what we treat as criminal or otherwise punishable misbehavior. And from there, I make an argument that there are some things we can do with law, and there are some laws that are effective, but the main point is that law with a light touch tends to be more effective than law with a heavy hand.
Okay. So let's say calling for business schools to have classes in ethics is not something you get really excited about.
I'm not a huge fan of that. Whenever we have a big corporate scandal or a crisis, the first thing we hear is that the culture on Wall Street has completely deteriorated, and what we need to do is to make a year-long mandatory ethics class in every business school curriculum. I think ethics classes can be great, but I think inevitably simply teaching people about what ethics is, what's right and what is wrong, is not enough. I believe that after a crisis, almost invariably, there are a couple things you want to do. One is you do want to talk about ethics and what went wrong. But another thing you want to do is look for laws that are helping to cause problems. Almost inevitably, something about the legal structure has given people an incentive to misbehave. There's something about the way the structure is set up that is putting people in the way of sin, that is tempting them to steal or to do things that are problematic. And I believe that has to be part of the answer. And it's not an argument that we can set up the system that's going to make sure nobody ever misbehaves, but it is an argument that there usually is a legal problem at the base of what we see as cultural problems, and fixing the overreach of the law needs to go hand in glove with talking about ethics, thinking about building character, and some of those things that do matter as part of the solution, but not the whole solution.
Right. So you can improve things a little bit, but there's no permanent fix apart from Christ.
Exactly.
So,
And in either direction, either by teaching more ethics, talking more about character, that by itself isn't going to be a complete fix. Changing the laws, making a better legal system, that's not going to be a complete fix. And it's surprising how important just understanding that point is. Just understanding we cannot create ourselves the perfect legal system. God has promised that he will ultimately bring perfect justice. He will use us, I believe, in that process, but we cannot do it by ourselves. It's a theme that's repeated over and over through the Bible. If you look at the Bible, starting with Adam and Eve, going through the Tower of Babel, repeatedly humans have tried to make themselves like God and tried to act as though they can control their own destiny and their own world, and it just doesn't work.
Yeah, and even when God created a model country, in a sense, like a model city recently, but a model country in Israel, still didn't work.
Absolutely.
Thus we have our desperate need for Christ, except no substitutes.
Absolutely. There is no substitute for Christ.
Let's see, time for questions for any of you. Hannah has a microphone here, so raise your hand if you want to ask a question. And while you're meditating on that for a moment, let me throw a real simple question at you. Define the Trinity.
I knew when you used the word simple, I was going to get something that has bedeviled theologians ever since Augustine and before. Well, to me, I have a simple mind despite my love for complexity. And for me, the Trinity is the fact that God is one God, but three persons. And we worship one God, but that God has a Father who has a distinctive relationship to the Son, each of whom has a distinctive relationship to the Spirit. And the relations between the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit introduce a kind of complexity to Christianity, which is on one level beyond our human understanding, but on another level really makes sense of a lot of our world. And one of the arguments that I make in the beauty chapter, I think it's the most speculative and maybe tendentious argument I make in the entire book, is I think the Trinity is the key or a primary key to understanding what we find beautiful in art. I think beauty in art inevitably involves tensions and complexity and two or more dimensions that both seem to be true but don't seem to be consistent with each other, and yet are true. And so that's how I think of the Trinity.
Okay.
Hi, my name is Hannah Czar. Thank you for being here. This has been an intriguing discussion.
Thank you.
I would like to just stay on the topic of art and beauty a little bit more, if you don't mind.
Sure.
Back to what you were talking about with Thomas Kincaid. Isn't it all right for Christian art to also show the the world that is to come, the other world, the unseen world. Can Christian art be idealistic versus just realistic of the sin-marred world? And in that sense, wasn't Thomas Kincaid's art, as an example, showing this world that is to come and an image of the pre-fallen world? And isn't there a place for that as well with Christian artists?
This is a great question. So I do think that there is a place for art to show the world to be, the world once God has transformed it. A couple reactions to that. So I absolutely think that is a legitimate quest. Certainly that's what Dante tried to do in the Paradiso. It is interesting that throughout history, people have never found Dante's paradise as interesting as his hell, as his inferno. But I'd say two things about Thomas Kincaid. One is, I don't understand this, but I do think that suffering has a way for us of enhancing our experience of beauty. And I don't want to push it too far, but there's something about our mortality, our limitedness, that makes beauty more vivid. And when you take the suffering out, I think it is very difficult to convey the same level of beauty. I think it might be possible, but I think it's more difficult. So that's the first thing that I would say. And as a result, I think efforts to portray beauty without suffering, without what we know now, usually fall flat, or at least a little bit. The second thing I would say, which maybe is an illustration of that with Kincaid, and I do want to emphasize, his paintings are very beautiful on one level, which is why I used him as an example. He was a very talented artist. But his paintings, to me, don't portray the world I imagine heaven being like. To me, they portray a vacation home where all of your cares have been removed. And so kind of earth without our current existence, without any of the annoyances and impediments and problems. And so maybe it's just that I imagine heaven a little bit differently than he does. I imagine heaven as involving a lot of earth. And our current life as being an important part of heaven, but I don't imagine it as being like a vacation home. And his art, to me, has a little bit of that feel, like it's trying to insulate us from bad things, whereas I imagine heaven as being a complete transformation of our experience. But I think that's a great question, and I may be wrong about that. The relationship between beauty and suffering is one I'm wrestling with a lot. And in fact, I'm thinking very seriously about writing another book, kind of like this one, on that theme in particular, embellishing, developing some of the beauty ideas, and in particular, working in how suffering fits together with it.
Now, I sometimes think about editing a news magazine in heaven. Do you think there's a law school in heaven?
I do think there's a law school in heaven, and Marvin knows what I say in the book, but one of the things I talk about in the book is I raise the question in the heaven chapter, will there be lawyers in heaven? And when I say that, when I'm talking about the book, I always get a laugh because people assume there can't possibly be lawyers in heaven because lawyers are the epitome of evil in our experience. I strongly believe there will be lawyers in heaven. I believe that it is possible to have complexity without sin, which kind of goes back to the Kincaid question and your issue. I don't know how to portray it well, but I do think that heaven will involve complexity without sin. That a big part of what lawyers do, one of the things lawyers do, is help people to navigate complexity, how to sort things out, how to build a building that you want to build. I think a lot of those issues will still exist in heaven, and that there will be a role for lawyers to help people navigate complexity without charging them too much, without cheating them, and actually helping them to achieve their goal in a way that doesn't involve sin.
So there'll be lawyers involved with mergers and acquisitions. sort of
Absolutely,
making deals.
yeah.
But there won't be divorce lawyers.
But this is, there won't be divorce lawyers, and don't push me too hard on which type of lawyer fits into each category, or I might lose my job.
Let's see.
What about, how should we think about laws concerning marriage when they clearly fly in opposition to Christian beliefs, but seems like the majority of people are moving in that direction? So how can the law help us, or what?
So this is another very, very difficult question, and the general answer I would give to that question, and might need to develop it some, but the general answer is with marriage and with other issues like divorce, adultery, things of that sort, I think it is very important to distinguish the secular and God's law. And so not everything that is identified as sin biblically, in my view, should be punished by the law in a particularly in a culture that's in a different place. And if you do try to police Christian morals in a heterogeneous culture, oftentimes the result is that the law is going to backfire. And so I, in our current culture, would not argue that we should make adultery illegal. I would not argue that we should make divorce illegal, because I think these kinds of laws backfire. The hot button issue, obviously, at our current moment is same-sex marriage. And with same-sex marriage, in my view, those who hold to a traditional view of marriage need to understand that cultural battle has been lost, at least for the short run. And in my view, and I'm stating this very baldly, but I believe, as most people do, that the Supreme Court is going to find a right to same-sex marriage when it decides the same-sex marriage case this spring. That cultural battle in the short run, in my view, is lost. What those who hold to a traditional view of marriage, in my view, should be focusing on is protecting the right of churches to honor a traditional view of marriage, not to have to honor other forms of marriage, and then over the next 20 or 30 years to live out what the Bible says about marriage in our marriages and in our churches. And if Christians who hold to a traditional view of marriage do this over the next 10 to 20 years, the culture might be in a different place. And so that's where I go on both of those kinds of issues. One is generally how to think about the secular law and the scope of the secular law, and the other is the particular hot button issues we have at this moment.
Let me ask, continuing on this hot button issue, of course, what's happening right now is folks going into, whether it's bakeries or photographer studios or T-shirt makers and so forth, and saying, I want you to do this. And the response tends to be, I'm not going to do it, and in fact, we're going to have it turns into a battle in the courts. How productive is that? Is there a better way to proceed?
Yeah, so I think it's a mistake to fight that fight, or to fight that fight hard. So and I know that Marvin may agree with me on this. I'm not sure if I'll push you or if you'll answer. I suspect some of y'all don't. This is not a view that's shared among all Christians, at least in my experience when I give talks on these issues. I think it's a mistake to do things like push the Indiana law. I mean, I think the backlash against the law, I think, was really unfair and was ill-founded in many regards. But I don't think that's the way forward. I think the way forward is to live out Christian values. And I don't mean stay away from politics, stay away from law. I don't think we should. I think we should be involved in law. I think we should be involved in politics. But I don't think fighting for laws that allow a photographer not to photograph a gay wedding I don't think it's a good idea in the current cultural environment, because it produces a backlash. And we've seen that backlash. The backlash in Indiana was remarkable. I mean, the extent of the backlash really surprised me, and I'm not surprised by much anymore. And so I don't think pushing those kinds of laws is a great idea. Some of them I'd probably agree with, depending on how the law was framed. Some of them I probably wouldn't agree with. But I really don't think that's where our energy should be put. I feel as though we learned some unfortunate lessons about that over the last 20 years or so, that when you think you're winning through the law, often you're not. And because I'm talking about sort of depressing things from a Christian perspective, let me use what I think is a more hopeful example, and that's abortion. Since Roe v. Wade was put in place and made abortion legal, the cultural strength has, in many respects, been on the pro-life side of that divide. It's still closely divided, but most Americans think abortion is wrong. A large majority of Americans are in support the ban on partial birth abortion. That, to me, is an example of how sometimes not having the law on your side can be helpful, and getting the law on your side can sometimes hurt you. And so I think we need to be really, really careful what we do with the law. In my own view, the time to push for passing a moral law, a law that is morally oriented, is when there is a cultural consensus behind that law. So I was absolutely in favor of passing a partial birth abortion ban, because there is something like a cultural consensus in favor of it. It's not unanimous, but it's a very large majority. I personally would not be in favor of passing laws where it's closer or the cultural weight is on the other side of the issue.
Any last questions here? Maybe room for one more? Or if not, let me just ask on abortion right now. The cultural mood has changed, certainly. Things are swinging in favor of protecting unborn life. Would you hope that the Supreme Court would change in some way, or is that something that still you think would create a backlash?
So if you mean by change overrule Roe versus Wade, my answer is no. Overrule Roe versus Wade today. Maybe not 10 years from now, maybe not 15 years from now. And this, I should say, when I say this, these are the most controversial things I talk about in Christian circles. I get lots of backlash when I say this. If you want some evidence of it, after I wrote an article with my friend Bill Stuntz about these issues, there was a 60-page screed in the Harvard Journal on Legislation about how wrong we are on Roe versus Wade. So that's the context in which you should put what I'm about to say. I think it would be a mistake to overturn Roe versus Wade tomorrow. And I've said this. I said this in the article with Bill Stuntz a few years ago, back in 2005, 2006. After that, we got lots of pushback from people saying abortion is an abomination, and therefore we should do whatever we can to overrule Roe versus Wade. After that, it was one of the Dakotas, I think it was South Dakota. Was it South Dakota? South Dakota, basically, as a matter of state law, banned abortion. They as a matter of state law, effectively overruled Roe versus Wade. What happened was there had not been a pro-choice movement in South Dakota. There was one instantly. The law was almost immediately overturned. There was such a big backlash against it. So, again, I think it's important to be careful what you wish for. The countervailing argument to this, which is one that I take very seriously, is there are times when we're called to be prophetic. You know, if no matter what the culture is like, if the culture were to pass a law that said you can't worship Jesus Christ, or Jesus Christ was not who he says he is, we would be called as Christians to oppose that law. There are times to be prophetic. Many people, and I'm included, point to the civil rights movement as an example of that, as a movement that was prophetic. In the beginning, it was a major uphill climb, but it actually had a big impact in the end. Some are of the view that that abortion is that kind of issue. I think it's pretty close to that kind of an issue, and so I understand when people disagree with me about this. But what I want to say is, if you disagree, you have to know that you're rowing uphill practically, that if you get what you want politically right now, there may be a backlash that leaves us in a worse position in worldly terms than we're in right now. Now, you might still say abortion is so evil that that's what we need to do, and I understand that, and I think you may be right, but my view is it's important to be practical. It's important to be mindful of what the limitations of the secular law are, and so I, at this point, am much more optimistic about smaller, incremental ways of eating away at abortion rather than just flipping the switch immediately.
So that's a lot to think about. Please join me in thanking David Skeel for getting us thinking.
We did not steer clear of anything. Right.